So it's lovely to be here. Thank you. And I started my professional life off as a social worker. And I decided that I would work with older people. And I did my training to work with older people. And within my first week of my professional social work life, I had 5 families where there were child abuse, child protection issues. And my life changed. And those children began to lead me to the path that I continued to take. Years went on, and I came to a point when I was working as a social worker in a hospital. I'd done work in the community for many years. And I was all set to do a lecture for medical students on working with child abuse. And my team manager said, "We've got a problem, Anne. There's a child who we think has been sexually abused who needs to be interviewed. And there's the lecture. I'm going to toss a coin. Whoever wins," no, she said, "whoever loses, beg your pardon, whoever loses gets to interview the child." I lost, but I also won, because I had the opportunity for the first time to sit and carefully listen and gently question a young person, a little boy of about 9 years old, who had been terribly abused. And he led the way for perhaps the rest of my life. He opened the door for me to go down. And for many years then, I both listened to young people and taught other people how to listen. And it's interesting, isn't it? Because we think listening is such a simple thing. But actually, it's one of the most difficult things for us to do. Because while we're listening, we're thinking about the next question we're going to ask. We might even be thinking about our shopping that we need to buy later, or all the other things we have to do. Or we're thinking our agenda, what we need to get from this listening, rather than being genuinely engaging in listening. And if we are to really listen, we're going to hear some very painful things about other people, but also about ourselves. So it's a challenge to listen, but it's such a gift that I encourage you to do it. And I'm going to tell you a few stories that perhaps will encourage you along the way. I want to first introduce you to Edith. Edith was a young woman of about 17 who'd been in public care for most of her life. She was an angry Nigerian woman. And she came storming into the offices of the charity that I ran that focused on listening to children. And she said, "And you can get out of the way, Anne. You're a wicked white witch." And I thought, I have a choice now. And I said, "Edith, would you just come back? I'd like to talk with you to understand why you think I'm a wicked white witch. Because that's not what I intend to be." So we went into the garden and we talked for 2 hours. And the outcome was that every foster carer she'd had was white. Every family that looked after her was white. They all let her down. Her social workers had all been white, mostly women, and had let her down in her eyes. So white women were just people that let people down. So for the first time, she had a white woman who listened, who allowed her the time to tell her whole story without interrupting her. And at the end of it, she said, "Is it possible for me as a 17-year-old to be an advocate for the charity? Can I be a volunteer for the charity? Can I speak on behalf of the charity?" And I'm sure by now that you've worked out that my answer was yes. She's gone on to do an MA in dance choreography. When I met her, she hadn't even got her GCSE, the first level of education certificates in the UK. So we are thrilled that she's managed to do something wonderful with her life. And yes, she continues to be a volunteer. But then about 10 years ago, We can probably put this more precisely. It was the February after the tsunami had occurred in Sri Lanka.
2014.
Thank you. We had a conference, and it was a conference that was led by children and young people. So there were workshops led by the children who had had parents or brothers or sisters die, who'd been through our groups with their parents, and had learnt some skills by listening and talking with each other. There was another group of children who'd all been through traumatic experiences at home through violence. There were children who were in public care, and there were children with various disabilities, some who had no verbal language at all, who used signing to communicate. And they all led workshops to which professionals were invited to hear their stories and to learn from them how best to work with them. And the stories that came out of it were amazing. They were wonderful and precious. It was led by a young person. Now, I hope you don't mind me swearing in English, because this is important to the story. We had a young man with various problems, but he also had Tourette's, which means that he would occasionally get into a loop where he would use swear language. And one of his favourite words was fuck, okay? And so he promised me he would not say this throughout the conference. But it got to the end of the conference, and he had chaired it so brilliantly. And he got up for the final bit and said, "This has been such a fucking good conference. Oh, I promised I wouldn't say fucking. Oh, fucking, I've said fucking." And at the end of it, when I took over, I said, "Well, I think I have no other words I can say, but I agree. What a fucking good conference." And he went away without having to feel embarrassed or shamed in any way. But the children who'd been leading the bereavement group, the group that had all had someone die in their family, came up to me afterwards and said, "We want to do something. Firstly, we want to thank you for all the work you've done with us, which has meant we've been able to tell our stories, to develop strategies for coping, and we're already helping other young children. But we want to go to Sri Lanka, and we want to help children who've been affected by the tsunami. Would you take us?" Of course, my answer is yes again. Let's think how we can do it. So we took a group of children and some parents and some volunteers, and for 3 weeks we led 3 groups a day. One group for the children, one group for their parents, and one group for professionals. And in those groups, everyone got an opportunity to tell their story whilst doing some practical activities. And at the end of it, I was told, "You've put smiles back onto people's faces. Everyone's just been trying to cope. They've not talked, and now people are talking." And the communities have continued with those groups. So it's wonderful to see that happening. So that began to get me thinking about the international field and whether this could work. The things that we'd learned in the UK, could they be transferred elsewhere? Sri Lanka taught us, yes, it could, that actually it was about listening, and that listening is a universal skill. So let me tell you a few stories. Let's go to Nigeria first. So in Nigeria, we work with a group of people who all are affected by leprosy. And some of us might think that leprosy is an outdated disease, but it's very much alive. And in the UK last year, there were about 250 people who were treated for leprosy. But in most countries now, it's not got the stigma anymore. And people get treated early and they don't have to live with the effects. Some of the people I work with there have told stories of how when you've really been affected by leprosy and your limbs are completely numb because the nerves have died, you get injured very quickly and easily. And one of the girls had to chase a rat away from her mother because overnight the rat was eating her mother's fingers and her mother couldn't feel it. So we sat and listened to their stories and worked around listening to all the children in the leprosy colony and then to some of the adults. And we had wonderful things happen, like I was talking to a 5-year-old and he was surrounded by his friends. And I said, "Look, is there anything that I can get for you? Anything at all?" And he said, yes, I would like a red bouncing ball. And that moment, I'm thinking, what would Swedish children or British children or children from anywhere else in the world ask for if I asked that question? Surely it wouldn't be just a simple bouncing ball. So I said, so just one ball? He said, yeah, I can share my ball with 20 or 30 other people. There's 250 children there. And then he did the calculation and said, maybe 5 balls. Then we can share between all of us. So does it have to be red? Oh, yes, it has to be red. OK. So I went to the local market and bought every ball I could find of all shapes and sizes and colours, gave those all over to the community and took him his red ball. I was then approached by a young man, and this young man was exceptional. We had put a well into the village because they had no running water. And he told me the story of how with his he had no hand this side and just 3 fingers on this hand. From the well to where he lived was probably about half a mile. And he dug a trench through the village and had laid a pipe down it, had built a concrete tank, filled it with water, and was growing carp, a type of fish. No one came into that village because of their fear of it, except those who wanted to buy that fish. And that gave me an idea. Rather than go round and meet all the people who had problems, let's go around and meet all the people who have business ideas. So he said, wow, that's an interesting idea. So I spent 2 or 3 days listening to many people. And by the end of it, I had an idea. We would set up a microeconomic project. In essence, what that means is people would come with ideas and we would give them a £25 loan, that's about 250 kroner, and a £25 grant. At the end of 1 year's training, their business must be in profit and they bring back their £25 loan, but they bring back with them another young person who wants to learn the same skills. That's been running now for nearly 10 years and we've had 250 young people through it. And the businesses are growing so beautifully that it's well known for people come there now to trade. So what was a complete disaster of a community because no one wanted to work with them because of the problems that were there, has now become a success through the young people that live there. Let me tell you a story from Lebanon. I was introduced to Lebanon about 6 years ago by a good friend. He's Lebanese and he wanted me to meet some young people who were all recovering from drug and alcohol addictions. I went along and they asked me to tell my story to them. It's a story I've told very often. I'm very familiar with my story and it's a very useful story because my childhood wasn't easy. We had times when we lived on the streets, so I understand street children. I was raped. I understand children who were raped. Many things happened in my life that helped me to engage with young people. And on this particular occasion, I told my story and it was translated by someone I relied on and could trust. And I was watching a young girl who was sitting, listening. Do you understand the word catatonic? Yeah? So completely emotionless, completely unable to respond to anything around her. She was just sitting in a fetal position on the floor. She was curled up on the floor, not responding to anything. And as I told my story, she began to crawl towards me. And she sat at my feet. And I asked permission to sit down and to bring her, may I bring her and hold her like a baby? And they said yes, and she said yes, which was astonishing because that was the first words from her mouth. And I'd discovered her story over the next 3 days. She had been sold when she was 3 years old and had been used as a sexual partner for all the years up until she was 18. She was fed drugs and alcohol to keep her quiet while she was abused. But when she reached 18, she was too old for her husband. And she was given as much drugs and alcohol as would keep her completely silent and comatose, whilst he left her on a rubbish tip, on a pile of garbage, which gave her the message, of course, that she was complete rubbish, as though her life hadn't already given that to her. I worked with her in Lebanon for some years. Every time I went back, I went and met with her again. She's now a member of staff. It's just extraordinary that just by her listening on this occasion, not me listening, but her listening and opening up, and me being able to give a bit of my story that she could relate to. Astonishing. How much time have we got? 5. Right, someone choose a country and I'll tell you a story. Which of the countries would you like me to go with? We've got left Romania, or Ghana, or South Africa. Which of those are you going to choose?
Romania.
Romania, okay, that got in first. In Romania, what we have been doing is working with children who are living in the orphanages, and we're working with the most traumatised and the most damaged children. And we've spent now almost 12 years going back and working with them and training staff about how to work with children who have experienced so little in their lives. When we first met some of them, you would have seen the pictures of the orphanages in the early days of us being able to get into Romania, and some of the appalling situations there. One of the pictures there is of a little girl called Anna. And I always remember her because she shares my name. And when we met her, she was tied to a cot. And she was sitting in a bed sodden with her own urine and feces. And she was rocking and banging her head on the wall, because that was the only contact she had with anything. And she'd just rock all day. And little by little by little, we managed to get the trust of the staff. And Anna would crawl to my side and spend time here. But there was also another young man that I met there who, how can I describe him? He was such a wonderful boy. He was about 9 years old when I met him. And he had a head that was about that size, because he should have had the fluid drained from his brain when he was little. And now he couldn't sit up or do anything, because his head, if his head was upright, it would have broken his neck. And I was told he couldn't hear, he couldn't speak, he couldn't understand people in terms of the people being people. So the first day I went in, I went and sang with him and talked with him. And I said, and my name is Anna, and your name is Ivan. So the next day I went in and I was talking as I came to see him. And this little boy turned his head. Now, for me, that's an indication. He's hearing something, isn't he? So I went and sang with him again and talked with him again. And apparently the next night he sang. And I would go back time and time and time again, and we got him beautiful things for above his head and films that he could watch from there. So his life began to have quality. Sadly, we'd got a lovely place for him in a local monastery, and he was going to have a wonderful life living there. We'd got the transport all arranged and a special bed for him. And it was just a nightmare to move him to his new home, but we'd found him somewhere that would care for him for the rest of his life. He died on the morning we should have taken him, before we even moved him, which was, for me, just such a sad thing. But Anna has continued through, I can't tell you how many problems we've had over the years, and how many times we've thought we would give up because she was such a problem. But she's now living semi-independently in a house that we've built in a little village in Romania. And she is living with 4 other of the young people that were in that first room when we first went into Romania. And she's every time anyone visits, she says, "Sit down. I want to listen to your story." It doesn't matter how long it takes. I want to hear your story. And she said, when I asked her about that, I said, what does that mean to you? And she said, listening is my gift. I can listen. People need to talk. They need their stories told. And I'm pleased that my story was heard. And now I can give that gift to other people. And I listen with all my ears. She said, I listen with all my ears. My heart ears, my mind ears, and these ears. And I thought that was such a wonderful way of describing listening, to listen with all these parts of our bodies. And she said, I have learnt so much from so many people. I cannot go many places. I'm just here, but I can listen. Thank you.